It's late. You're probably tired. And before you close your eyes tonight, I want to tell you something. There's this story about a man named Isaac Newton. Now, you probably think you know who he is. You've heard the name. Maybe you remember something about apples falling from trees, or gravity, or some complicated mathematics that made your head hurt in school. But that's not really his story, not the one I want to tell you. His story is about something else entirely. It's about a person who was born into nothing, a boy nobody wanted, a child who was abandoned by his father before he was even born, and then rejected by his mother when he was just 3 years old. Think about that for a moment. Imagine being so small, so young, and having the people who were supposed to love you, most simply, leave. But here's the thing. This isn't a sad story. Not really. It's a story about what happens when life takes everything from you. When you're an outsider. When you're hurt. When you're alone. And somehow, despite all of that, you become one of the greatest minds in human history. I think you need to hear the story, especially tonight, because Newton's journey teaches us something we desperately need to understand. It's about the power of solitude, the strength found in rejection, and how the very things that break us can also build us into something extraordinary. So settle in, get comfortable, and let me tell you about the boy no one wanted and how he changed the world. Let me take you back to the year 1642. It's England, and the country is torn apart by civil war. Kings and commoners are fighting in the streets. Everything feels uncertain. Everything feels like it's falling apart. And in the middle of all this chaos, in a small village called Woolsthorpe in Lincolnshire, a baby boy was born. His name was Isaac Newton. But here's the thing about Isaac's birth. His father, also named Isaac, was already dead. He died 3 months before his son was even born. So this baby, this tiny, fragile child, would never know his father. He would never hear his voice. He would never feel his hand. He came into the world fatherless, and that absence would shape everything about who he became. His mother, Hannah, she was grieving. She was overwhelmed. She was a widow with a newborn son in a country tearing itself apart. When Isaac was just 3 years old, she made a decision. She sent him away. She left him with his grandmother and went to live with another man, hoping for a better life for herself. Can you imagine that? Being so small, so dependent, and having your mother simply disappear from your life. He thought in the way that children do without really understanding, I am not enough. I am not worth staying for. That wound, that early abandonment, it never really healed. It became part of him. It became part of how he saw the world. He was alone. He was unwanted. And he learned very early that he couldn't depend on other people. He could only depend on himself. His grandmother tried her best. She was kind enough, I think. But she wasn't his mother. She was a substitute, a replacement for something he'd lost, before he even understood what he'd lost. Young Isaac grew up in that house in that village, with a constant knowledge that he was living with someone, because his real mother didn't want him. That's a heavy thing for a child to carry. The other children in Woolsthorpe, they sensed it somehow. Children are cruel, aren't they? They can smell weakness. They can sense when someone doesn't quite belong. Isaac was different. He was quiet. He was withdrawn. He didn't play the games the other children played. He didn't roughhouse or laugh easily. He was small for his age, and he was odd. So they rejected him. They mocked him. They made sure he knew he didn't belong. But instead of breaking him, something else happened. Instead of giving up, instead of trying harder to fit in, Isaac turned inward. He discovered books. He discovered nature. He discovered that the world around him was far more interesting than the children who rejected him. He would spend hours alone watching how things worked. how light moved through the air, how plants grew, how water flowed. He was teaching himself to see the world in a way that other people couldn't. He felt something shifting inside him during those lonely hours. He realized, if they won't accept me, I don't need them. I can find answers on my own. This wasn't arrogance exactly. It was survival. It was a child learning that rejection could be transformed into independence. That loneliness could become focus. That being an outsider could actually be a gift if you learned to see it that way. By the time he was a teenager, Isaac had become almost entirely self-sufficient emotionally. He didn't expect love from people. He didn't seek approval. He didn't need friends the way other boys did. This made him seem cold to people who didn't understand him. They thought he was strange, unfriendly, difficult. But what they didn't see was that he was building something inside himself. He was constructing a fortress of knowledge and understanding that no one could take away from him. His mother eventually came back into his life when he was older. She remarried again, and then her second husband died, and she came back to Woolsthorpe. But by then, the damage was done. The bond between mother and son was broken. Isaac was polite to her. He was dutiful, but he never truly forgave her for leaving. That wound stayed with him his entire life. When he was sent away to school at the King's School in Grantham, he boarded with an apothecary. Again he was living with strangers. Again he was separated from any family connection. But by this point, he'd learned how to survive it. He'd learned how to use his isolation. He threw himself into his studies with an intensity that surprised his teachers. He was hungry for knowledge in a way that most children weren't. It was as if he was trying to fill the empty space inside him with understanding, with facts, with the secrets of how the world worked. The other students at school, they still rejected him. He was still the odd one, still the boy who didn't quite fit, still the one who preferred books to friendship. But now, instead of hurting him, their rejection simply confirmed what he already knew. He was different. He was alone. And that was okay. That was actually better than okay. That was his strength. By the time young Isaac Newton reached his teenage years, he had already learned one of life's most difficult lessons. He had learned that you cannot depend on other people to validate you. You cannot depend on them to love you unconditionally. You cannot depend on them to make you feel like you belong. The only thing you can truly depend on is yourself, your mind, your determination, your ability to understand the world on your own terms. This knowledge would carry him forward. It would drive him. It would also eventually isolate him in ways that would be both his greatest strength and his deepest tragedy. But for now, in those early years, it was simply survival. It was a lonely boy learning to transform his pain into purpose. When Isaac Newton arrived at the King's School in Grantham, he was around 12 years old. The year was 1654, and England was still recovering from its civil war. The country was uncertain. The future was unclear. And for a boy like Isaac, who'd already learned that the world wasn't a safe or welcoming place, this new school was just another battleground. The school itself was a place of rigid discipline and harsh expectations. The headmaster believed in strict rules, corporal punishment, and the classical education that was considered proper for boys of a certain station. Latin, Greek, religious instruction, mathematics. The curriculum was demanding, and the teaching methods were brutal. If you didn't know your lessons, you got beaten. If you stepped out of line, you got beaten. If you looked at the master the wrong way, you got beaten. That was just how it was. But for Isaac, this environment wasn't entirely foreign. He'd already learned to keep his head down. He'd already learned to observe rather than participate. He'd already learned to find safety in his own mind. So while other boys were struggling with the transition, crying for their mothers or rebelling against the authority, Isaac simply adapted. The problem was the other boys. They were cruel in that particular way that schoolboys can be. Isaac was small. He was quiet. He didn't have the easy confidence that came from being wanted, from being loved, from knowing that someone at home was waiting for him. The other students could sense this somehow. They could smell the loneliness on him, and they targeted him for it. They mocked him. They called him names. They excluded him from their games and their friendships. They would push him around in the corridors. They would steal his things. They would make jokes at his expense, and when he didn't laugh, they'd say he had no sense of humor. When he tried to join in, they'd say he was trying too hard. There was no winning. There was no way to be accepted. The verdict had been decided before he even arrived. Isaac Newton was an outsider, and outsiders didn't belong. Most children would have broken under this pressure. They would have either become aggressive and fought back, or they would have retreated entirely, becoming depressed and withdrawn. But Isaac did something different. He didn't fight the other boys. He didn't try to win them over. Instead, he simply ignored them. He turned his attention elsewhere. He focused on the one place where he could actually succeed, where his efforts would be rewarded, where he could prove his worth. He focused on his studies. Now, this might sound simple, but think about what was actually happening here. Isaac was making a conscious choice. He was deciding that the approval of his peers didn't matter. He was deciding that fitting in was less important than excelling. He was deciding that if the world wouldn't accept him as he was, then he would become so exceptional that they couldn't ignore him. Not out of spite exactly, but out of necessity, out of survival. He threw himself into his schoolwork with an intensity that alarmed his teachers. While other boys were daydreaming or passing notes or counting down the minutes until they could leave, Isaac was absorbing everything. He was asking questions that went beyond what the masters were teaching. He was reading books that weren't assigned. He was thinking about problems in ways that his teachers hadn't considered. His Latin improved rapidly. His Greek became fluent. But it was mathematics that truly captured him. Mathematics was pure. It was logical. It didn't care about your social status or whether you were liked or whether you belonged. Mathematics was honest. 2 plus 2 equaled 4, whether you were a king or a pauper, whether you were popular or alone. There was something deeply comforting about that for a boy like Isaac. He thought to himself during those long study sessions, here in these numbers and these proofs, I can build something real. I can create something that matters. I can become someone. It wasn't arrogance. It was determination. It was a young man recognizing that the world had rejected him and deciding that he would reject the world's standards in return. He would create his own measure of success. He would define his own worth. By his second year at school, something had shifted. The other boys still didn't like him. They still excluded him. But now, there was something else mixed in with their rejection. There was a grudging respect. The teachers had begun to recognize that this quiet, strange boy was brilliant. He was solving problems that older students couldn't solve. He was understanding concepts that should have been beyond his years. He was becoming exceptional. This didn't make him popular. If anything, it made him more isolated. Because now, in addition to being the lonely outsider, he was also the boy who made the others look bad. He was the one who showed them up in class. He was the one who reminded them that they weren't as smart as they thought they were. So they resented him even more. But they also couldn't quite dismiss him anymore. Isaac didn't mind. In fact, he preferred it this way. He was beginning to understand something crucial about himself. He didn't need their friendship. He didn't need their approval. What he needed was to understand. What he needed was to learn. What he needed was to become someone who mattered, even if he had to do it alone. When he was around 14 years old, something happened that changed the trajectory of his life. His mother decided to pull him out of school. She wanted him to come home to Woolsthorpe and help manage the family farm. This was a common practice at the time. Education was expensive, and if you had a son who could work, you put him to work. It was practical. It was economical. It was also, in Isaac's case, a disaster, because Isaac Newton was not a farmer. He had no interest in crops or livestock or the daily management of agricultural land. He was terrible at it, actually. He would wander off into the fields and get lost in thought. He would forget to do his chores. He would sit under trees and stare at the sky instead of tending to his duties. His mother was furious with him. She thought he was lazy. She thought he was ungrateful. She didn't understand that her son's mind was simply not built for this kind of work. But here's where the turning point came. The headmaster of the King's School, a man named Henry Stokes, recognized what was happening. He understood that Isaac Newton was no ordinary student. He understood that pulling this boy out of school would be a waste of an extraordinary mind. So he did something remarkable. He went to Isaac's mother and he convinced her to let her son return to school. He argued that Isaac had potential, that he could go to university, that he could become something great. It took persuasion. It took the headmaster essentially saying, "Trust me, this boy is different. This boy is special." And somehow Hannah Newton listened. She allowed her son to return to school. She allowed him to continue his education. In that moment, Isaac felt something he hadn't felt in a long time. He felt seen. He felt recognized, not by his peers, not by his family, but by an adult who understood what he was capable of. And that recognition, that belief in him, it crystallized something inside him. He knew, this is my path. This is what I'm meant to do. I will become a scholar. I will become a man of learning. And I will do it alone if I have to. The quiet rebellion had become a clear mission. In 1661, at the age of 18, Isaac Newton arrived at Trinity College, Cambridge. It was a significant moment. He was leaving behind the village of Woolsthorpe, leaving behind the rejection and isolation of his childhood, and entering a world of scholars and learning. For the first time, he was surrounded by people who valued what he valued. People who cared about mathematics and natural philosophy and understanding how the world worked. But even at Cambridge, even in this place that should have been perfect for him, Isaac remained an outsider. He was poor. Most of the other students came from wealthy families. They had connections. They had social standing. They had the easy confidence that comes from privilege. Isaac had none of that. He was there on a scholarship, which meant he had to work to pay his way. He had to serve other students. He had to clean. He had to do menial tasks. He was quite literally a servant in the college. The other students knew this. They treated him accordingly. He was the scholarship boy, the one without money, the one without family connections, the one who had to work while they studied. So even though he was finally in a place where intellectual pursuit was valued, he was still rejected. He was still on the outside looking in. But Cambridge also gave him something that Woolsthorpe and the King's School couldn't. It gave him access to books, real books, hundreds of them, thousands of them. The college library was a treasure trove of knowledge. And Isaac, who'd spent his childhood and adolescence hungry for understanding, who'd used learning as his escape and his solace, now had access to everything he could possibly want to read. He devoured it all. He read the ancient mathematicians. He read Descartes and Galileo and Kepler. He read about optics and mechanics and the nature of light. He stayed up late into the night reading by candlelight, filling his notebooks with observations and questions and ideas. His tutors recognized his brilliance. His professors began to notice him. Slowly, carefully, he was building a reputation as an exceptional mind. But then in 1665, everything changed. The Great Plague arrived in England. The plague was devastating. It was a bubonic plague spread by rats and fleas, and it killed thousands upon thousands of people. London was hit the hardest. The streets were lined with bodies. Entire families were wiped out. The death toll was so high that they couldn't bury people fast enough. Mass graves were dug. The smell of death hung over the city. People were terrified. They didn't know how it spread. They didn't know how to stop it. All they knew was that it was killing people indiscriminately. Cambridge, like other universities, was forced to close. The authorities believed that crowded places spread the disease. So the students were sent home. The scholars were dispersed. The college that had finally accepted Isaac, that had finally given him a place where he belonged, was suddenly empty. And Isaac was sent back to Woolsthorpe, back to the village, back to his mother, back to the isolation he thought he'd escaped. He was 22 years old. He'd finally found his place in the world. He'd finally begun to build a life as a scholar. And now he was trapped in the countryside with nothing but his thoughts and his books, and the constant awareness that death was stalking the land. Most people would have been devastated. Most people would have despaired. But Isaac Newton was not most people. He thought, I am alone again, but this time I choose what to do with that solitude. What happened next is one of the most remarkable periods in the history of human thought. What historians now call the Annus Mirabilis, or the Year of Wonders, though it actually lasted about 18 months. From roughly late 1665 to early 1667, while the plague raged outside and people died by the thousands, Isaac Newton, alone in his mother's house in Woolsthorpe, made discoveries that would fundamentally change human understanding of the universe. He developed calculus. He didn't just invent one method of calculus. He developed an entire system of mathematics that would become essential to physics engineering and virtually every scientific field that came after. He was solving problems that mathematicians had been struggling with for centuries. He was creating new tools for understanding change and motion and infinity. He conducted experiments with light and prisms. He discovered that white light was actually composed of all the colors of the spectrum. He realized that light could be separated and recombined. He developed theories about the nature of color that wouldn't be fully understood or accepted for decades. He was laying the groundwork for modern optics. And then, perhaps most famously, he began thinking about gravity. The story goes that he saw an apple fall from a tree in his mother's garden, and something about that simple event sparked a question in his mind. Why does the apple fall? What force is pulling it down? And if that force extends to the apple, does it extend to the moon as well? He realized something profound in that moment. He knew there is a force that holds the universe together, a force that keeps the planets in their orbits, a force that pulls objects towards the earth, and I can describe it mathematically. He spent months working on this problem. He filled notebook after notebook with calculations and diagrams and proofs. He was working at a level of intellectual intensity that's almost impossible to imagine. He was barely sleeping. He was barely eating. He was so focused on his work that he sometimes forgot to get dressed. His mother would find him in his study, surrounded by papers, lost in thought, still wearing his nightclothes from the day before. He was alone, yes, but he was also completely free. There were no distractions, no social obligations. No need to pretend to be something he wasn't. No one expecting him to be anything other than what he was. He had nothing but time and solitude and the infinite mysteries of the universe to contemplate. In those months, Isaac Newton experienced something that few people ever experience. He experienced the complete alignment of his abilities with his circumstances. He was exactly where he needed to be, doing exactly what he needed to do with exactly the resources he needed. The plague that was killing thousands of people had paradoxically given him the gift of uninterrupted solitude. It had removed all the distractions and obligations that might have pulled him away from his work. He realized as he worked late into the nights, this is what I was meant to do. This is who I am. I am not meant for society. I'm not meant for friendship or popularity or fitting in. I am meant for this, for understanding, for discovery, for seeing what no one else can see. By the time the plague ended and Cambridge reopened, Isaac Newton had fundamentally transformed human knowledge. He had done it alone. He had done it in isolation. He had done it in a small house in the countryside while the world was falling apart around him. He was no longer just a brilliant student. He was a genius, and he knew it. Let me paint you a picture of what those months were really like. Imagine being 22 years old, trapped in a small house in the English countryside. The plague is still raging outside. People are dying. You can hear the church bells tolling for the dead. The world feels like it's ending. And inside this house in a small study, a young man is sitting at a desk, surrounded by papers and books and mathematical instruments. This is Isaac Newton during the plague years. And what he's doing in that room is nothing short of miraculous. The calculus he develops during this period is extraordinary. You see, mathematics up until this point had certain limitations. Mathematicians could work with static objects, and yet they could calculate the area of a circle. They could find the length of a line. But they struggled with anything that involved change, anything that involved motion, anything that involved rates of change. How do you calculate the speed of something that's constantly accelerating? How do you find the area under a curve that's constantly changing shape? These were problems that had stumped the greatest minds in Europe. But Isaac, working alone in his study, figured it out. He developed what he called the method of fluxions. It's what we now call calculus. And it's one of the most powerful mathematical tools ever created. With calculus, you can describe motion. You can predict trajectories. You can understand how things change over time. You can model the universe itself. But here's the thing that's important to understand. He didn't develop this because he was trying to solve an abstract mathematical puzzle. He developed it because he needed it. He needed the tools to describe gravity. He needed the mathematics to explain how planets move. He needed calculus to answer the questions that were burning in his mind. The mathematics came from necessity. It came from genuine curiosity about how the world actually works. At the same time, he was conducting experiments with light. He had a prism. He had a darkened room. He had sunlight coming through a small hole in the shutters. And he was systematically investigating what happened when light passed through the prism. What he discovered was revolutionary. He discovered that white light wasn't actually white. It was a mixture of all the colors. When you passed white light through a prism, it separated into a spectrum. Red, orange, yellow, green, blue, indigo, violet. All the colors were there hidden in what appeared to be colorless light. This was shocking to people at the time. The prevailing theory was that color came from the prism itself, that the prism somehow added color to the light. But Isaac proved that wasn't true. The color was already in the light. The prism just revealed it. He was so meticulous in his experiments that he even took a second prism and recombine the separated colors back into white light. He was proving his theory with absolute certainty. He thought as he watched the colors separate and recombine, I am seeing something that no one else has seen. I am understanding something that has been hidden since the beginning of time. The universe is revealing its secrets to me. But the work that would ultimately define his legacy was his investigation into gravity. This is where everything came together. This is where his mathematical genius, his experimental precision, and his ability to think in completely new ways all converged. He started with a simple observation. The moon orbits the Earth. The planets orbit the sun. What keeps them in their orbits? What force prevents them from flying off into space? And then he made the conceptual leap that changed everything. He realized that the same force that pulls an apple to the ground might also be the force that keeps the moon in orbit. The same force might govern the entire universe. This seems obvious to us now. But at the time, this was a radical idea. People thought that the laws governing the heavens were completely different from the laws governing the earth. The heavens were perfect and eternal and unchanging. The earth was imperfect and temporary and always changing. They operated according to different principles. That's what people believed. But Isaac realized they were wrong. He realized that the same laws applied everywhere. That the universe was governed by consistent mathematical principles that applied to everything from the smallest object to the largest celestial body. This was a profound insight. It was almost spiritual in its implications. It suggested that the universe was fundamentally orderly, that it was comprehensible, that human reason could understand it. He spent months working on the mathematics of gravity. He filled notebook after notebook with calculations. He was trying to prove that if gravity decreased with the square of the distance, then the orbital mechanics of the planets would work out exactly as observed. He was trying to show that his theory matched reality, that his mathematics predicted what actually happened in the sky. And it did. His calculations worked. The theory held up. He had figured it out. He had discovered the fundamental force that holds the universe together. He felt something profound in those moments. He knew, I have touched something eternal. I have understood something that is true about the very fabric of reality. I have seen into the mind of God. That's not hyperbole. That's what he actually believed. He thought that by understanding the mathematical laws of nature, he was understanding God's design. He was reading the language in which God had written the universe. But there was also something else he felt. Something darker. He felt the weight of what he knew. He felt the burden of understanding. Because once you see the universe this way, once you understand how it really works, you can never unsee it. You can never go back to the comfortable ignorance of not knowing. The world becomes different, more complex, more lonely. He thought late at night, surrounded by his papers. No one else understands this. No one else sees what I see. I am alone with this knowledge. I am the only person in the world who truly comprehends these truths. This was both exhilarating and terrifying. It was exhilarating because he was discovering things that no human had ever discovered before. He was expanding the boundaries of human knowledge. He was becoming something more than human in his understanding. But it was terrifying because it was isolating. It was separating him from everyone else. It was making him fundamentally different from other people in a way that couldn't be bridged. The plague continued outside. People continued to die. The world continued to suffer. But inside his study, Isaac Newton was working at a level of intellectual intensity that's almost impossible to comprehend. He was barely aware of what was happening outside. He was barely aware of his own body's needs. He was completely absorbed in his work, completely consumed by the mysteries he was unraveling. By the time the plague ended and Cambridge reopened in 1667, Isaac had accomplished something extraordinary. He had single-handedly advanced human knowledge in three major areas: mathematics, optics, and mechanics. He had done it alone. He had done it in isolation. He had done it in a small house in the countryside, while the world was falling apart. He returned to Cambridge, not as a scholarship student trying to prove himself. He returned as a genius, as someone who had seen deeper into the nature of reality than anyone else alive, as someone who carried within him secrets about the universe that no one else possessed. But he also returned as someone profoundly changed. The isolation had shaped him. The intensity of his work had shaped him. The weight of his knowledge had shaped him. He was no longer quite human in the way that other people were human. He was something else, something more, something that could never quite fit into normal society again. When Isaac Newton returned to Cambridge in 1667, he was a changed man. He was still only 24 years old, but he carried within him discoveries that would revolutionize human understanding. He had calculus. He had his theory of light. He had gravity. He had enough material to publish several groundbreaking works that would establish him as the greatest mind of his age. But he didn't publish anything, not for 20 years. Think about that for a moment. 20 years, 2 decades of silence, 2 decades of keeping his discoveries to himself, 2 decades of knowing things that could change the world and choosing not to share them. Why would someone do that? Why would a genius deliberately hide his genius? The answer is complicated, and it tells us something important about Isaac Newton. It tells us that he wasn't just a brilliant mind. He was also deeply afraid. He was afraid of criticism. He was afraid of conflict. He was afraid of being wrong. And most importantly, he was afraid of other people. After a lifetime of rejection and isolation, after years of being an outsider, after experiencing the profound loneliness of being fundamentally different from everyone around him, Isaac Newton had learned to distrust people. He had learned that other people could hurt you. They could mock you. They could tear down your work. They could make you regret ever trying. When he did share some of his work with other scholars, the experience confirmed his worst fears. In 1672, he published a paper on light and color in the Philosophical Transactions of the Royal Society. It was a significant work. It presented his discoveries about the nature of light. It was groundbreaking. It was also immediately attacked. Other scientists disagreed with him. They challenged his conclusions. They suggested alternative explanations. They questioned his methods. And instead of engaging in healthy scientific debate, instead of using their criticism to refine his ideas, Isaac took it personally. He felt attacked. He felt wounded. He felt like people were trying to tear him down, just like they'd always done. One of his critics was a man named Robert Hooke, another brilliant scientist of the time. Hooke had his own theories about light, and he believed Newton was wrong. The two men argued back and forth. The disagreement became heated. It became personal, and Isaac hated it. He hated the conflict. He hated the feeling of being attacked. He hated having to defend his work to people he felt didn't understand it. He thought in the midst of this conflict, why should I share my work with people who will only tear it down? Why should I expose myself to this kind of treatment? I am better off keeping my discoveries to myself. And so he withdrew. He stopped publishing. He stopped sharing his work. He went back into isolation. And for the next 2 decades, he kept his discoveries locked away inside himself. This wasn't just about being sensitive to criticism. There was something deeper going on. Isaac was afraid of something more fundamental. He was afraid of power. He was afraid of what would happen if his ideas became public. He was afraid of the responsibility that would come with being recognized as a genius. He was afraid of losing control. You see, as long as his discoveries remained private, as long as they existed only in his notebooks, in his mind he had complete control over them. No one could challenge them. No one could misuse them. No one could claim credit for them. They were his. They belonged to him alone. They were safe. But if he published them, if he made them public, then they would belong to the world. Other people could build on them. Other people could criticize them. Other people could take them in directions he hadn't intended. He would lose control. And for someone like Isaac Newton, someone who'd spent his entire life trying to maintain control in a world that had rejected him, the thought of losing that control was unbearable. So he kept silent. He continued his work. He made new discoveries. He refined his theories. But he didn't share them. He didn't publish them. He kept them locked away. During these years, he was made a fellow of Trinity College and then a professor. He was recognized as a brilliant scholar. But his reputation was based on potential, not on actual published work. People knew he was smart. They didn't know just how smart. They didn't know about the calculus. They didn't know about his complete theory of gravity. They didn't know about the depth and breadth of his understanding. He was living a double life. On the surface, he was a respected academic, but inside he was carrying secrets. He was carrying the weight of knowledge that he couldn't share. He was carrying the burden of discoveries that were changing nothing because no one knew about them. The pressure built up inside him. Year after year, the pressure accumulated. He was working constantly, but his work was invisible. He was making breakthroughs, but no one knew about them. He was becoming more and more isolated, more and more withdrawn, more and more consumed by his own thoughts. He became increasingly difficult to be around. He was irritable. He was suspicious. He was paranoid about people stealing his ideas. He would accuse other scholars of plagiarism. He would engage in bitter disputes over priority. He would spend enormous amounts of energy fighting with other scientists about who had discovered something first, even though he hadn't actually published his discoveries. He felt during these long years of silence, I am the only one who truly understands. I am the only one who can see the truth, and I must protect that truth. I must keep it safe from people who would corrupt it, or misuse it, or claim it as their own. This was both his strength and his weakness. His obsessive need to maintain control, his refusal to share his work until it was absolutely perfect, his fear of criticism and conflict. These things kept him from publishing, but they also kept him isolated. They kept him from engaging with the scientific community. They kept him from building on the work of others. They kept him from experiencing the joy of collaboration and shared discovery. He was brilliant, yes, but he was also trapped by his own fear, trapped by his own need for control, trapped by the very isolation that had made him a genius, and the world meanwhile was moving on without him. Other scientists were making discoveries. Other mathematicians were developing new ideas. The scientific revolution was happening all around him, and Isaac Newton, the greatest mind of his age, was sitting in his study in Cambridge, keeping his discoveries to himself. He knew deep down that this couldn't continue forever. He knew that eventually he would have to share his work. He knew that his discoveries were too important to keep hidden. But the thought of doing so terrified him. The thought of exposing himself to the world, of making himself vulnerable to criticism and attack, of losing control of his life's work. It was almost unbearable, so he waited. He worked. He refined his theories, and he kept his silence. 20 years of silence. 20 years of carrying the weight of genius alone. In 1684, something happened that would finally break Newton's silence. A man named Edmund Halley came to visit him at Cambridge. Halley was a respected astronomer and mathematician. He was also someone who understood the importance of Newton's work. He'd heard rumors about Newton's discoveries. He knew that Newton had figured out something profound about gravity and planetary motion, and he wanted to know what it was. When Halley asked Newton directly about his work on gravity, Newton told him. He explained his theory. He showed Halley his calculations, and Halley was astonished. He realized immediately that what Newton had discovered was revolutionary. It was the key to understanding the entire universe. It was the most important scientific work of the age. But Halley also realized something else. He realized that Newton would never publish this work on his own. Newton was too afraid, too isolated, too trapped by his own need for control and perfection. So Halley did something remarkable. He convinced Newton to write it all down. He convinced Newton to organize his thoughts into a comprehensive work. He convinced Newton to publish. It took persuasion. It took patience. It took Halley essentially saying, "Your work is too important to keep hidden. The world needs to know what you've discovered. You need to share this." And slowly, reluctantly, Isaac Newton agreed. What followed was one of the most intense periods of creative work in human history. Newton threw himself into writing what would become his masterpiece, the Philosophia Naturalis Principia Mathematica, or the mathematical principles of natural philosophy. We know it simply as the Principia. It's one of the most important scientific books ever written. He worked obsessively. He barely slept. He barely ate. He was completely consumed by the work of organizing and presenting his discoveries in a way that would be clear and rigorous and absolutely undeniable. He was writing in Latin, the language of scholarship. He was using mathematical proofs to demonstrate his theories. He was creating a work that would stand for centuries as the foundation of modern physics. Halley didn't just encourage Newton to write. He also paid for the publication. He edited the manuscript. He helped Newton refine his arguments. He was in many ways the midwife to Newton's genius. Without Halley, the Principia might never have been published. Newton might have taken his discoveries to the grave, and the world would have been poorer for it. The book was published in 1687, and it changed everything. When the Principia appeared, it was immediately recognized as a masterwork. Here was a complete mathematical description of how the universe worked. Here was a theory that explained the motion of planets and the fall of apples with the same elegant equations. Here was proof that the universe operated according to mathematical laws that human reason could understand. Newton became famous almost overnight. He was no longer just a respected scholar. He was the greatest scientist in the world. He was the man who had figured out how gravity worked. He was the man who had unified heaven and earth under a single set of mathematical principles. He was celebrated. He was honored. He was recognized as a genius, and he hated it. The fame brought attention, yes, but it also brought obligations. It brought expectations. It brought people wanting things from him. People wanted him to explain his work. People wanted him to engage in debates. People wanted access to him. People wanted to be near him, to know him, to be part of his circle. And Isaac Newton's, who'd spent his entire life avoiding people, who'd built his genius on the foundation of isolation, suddenly found himself thrust into the public eye. He thought as the letters and requests poured in, "I have made a terrible mistake. I have exposed myself. I have made myself vulnerable. And now I cannot take it back." But there was something else happening too. something more complicated. Because along with the burden of fame came something that Newton had never experienced before: power, real power, influence, authority. For the first time in his life, people listened to him. People respected him. People deferred to him. And he discovered that he liked it. This is where Newton's story takes a darker turn. Because the man who had been rejected his entire life, who had been an outsider, who had been mocked and excluded and made to feel worthless, that man suddenly had the opportunity to be someone, to be important, to be respected, to be in control. In 1696, Newton was offered a position as Master of the Royal Mint. It was a prestigious position. It was also a position of real power and authority. And Newton accepted it. He moved to London. He left Cambridge. He left his life as a scholar and became an administrator, a man with power over others. And he used that power in ways that surprised people. He became obsessed with catching counterfeiters. He pursued them relentlessly. He would go out into the streets of London in disguise, trying to catch people making fake coins. When he caught them, he prosecuted them with brutal efficiency. He sent people to prison. He sent people to execution. He became known as someone who was ruthless in his pursuit of counterfeiters. This wasn't just about enforcing the law. This was about something deeper. This was about a man who had been powerless his entire life, suddenly having the ability to exercise power over others. And he exercised it with an intensity that bordered on obsession. He felt, during those years, finally I have control. Finally I have authority. Finally people must listen to me. Finally I can make them do what I want. It was a corruption of sorts. Not a moral corruption exactly, but a spiritual one. The man who had discovered the laws of nature, who had understood the universe in ways that no one else could, was now using his position to punish and control. The man who had been isolated and rejected was now isolating and rejecting others. The man who had suffered under the authority of others was now wielding authority over others. He also became involved in bitter disputes with other scientists. He fought with Gottfried Leibniz over who had invented calculus first. He fought with Robert Hooke over credit for discoveries in optics. He used his position and his authority to try to discredit his rivals. He became vindictive. He became petty. He became someone who was more concerned with defending his reputation than with advancing knowledge. In 1703, he was elected president of the Royal Society, one of the most prestigious scientific organizations in the world, and he used that position to consolidate his power. He used it to promote his allies and punish his enemies. He used it to ensure that his version of events, his interpretation of history, his claims about who had discovered what first became the official record. He was no longer just a genius. He was a powerful man, and power, as it so often does, corrupted him. Not in a dramatic way, not in a way that made him evil or villainous, but in a subtle way. It changed him. It made him less generous, less open, less willing to collaborate, more concerned with protecting his legacy than with advancing science. He knew somewhere deep inside, I have become the thing I feared. I have become someone who uses power to control others. I have become someone who is more concerned with authority than with truth. But he couldn't stop. He couldn't go back. The isolation that had made him a genius had also made him incapable of handling power in a healthy way. He had no experience with collaboration. He had no experience with sharing credit. He had no experience with being part of a community. So when he finally had power, he wielded it like a weapon. He wielded it to protect himself, to control others, to ensure that no one could ever hurt him or take away what he'd built. The man who had discovered the laws of nature had become a prisoner of his own nature, and the world was beginning to see it. Let me tell you about the streets of London in the 1690s. They were dangerous, chaotic, filled with crime and poverty and desperation. And they were also filled with counterfeiters, men and women who made fake coins, who clipped the edges off real coins and sold them as full value, who melted down precious metals and mixed them with cheaper materials to stretch their profits. It was a serious crime. It undermined the entire economy. It threatened the stability of the kingdom. When Isaac Newton took the position of Master of the Royal Mint, he decided that he would personally eliminate counterfeiting, not just enforce the law, not just do his job adequately, but personally, obsessively, ruthlessly eliminate it. He would become a detective. He would become a hunter. He would become someone who pursued criminals with an intensity that was almost supernatural. He would go out into the streets of London at night, disguised, trying to catch counterfeiters in the act. He would infiltrate their operations. He would gather evidence. He would build cases against them. And then he would prosecute them with a ferocity that shocked people. He didn't just want to catch them. He wanted to destroy them. He wanted to make examples of them. He wanted to send a message that counterfeiting would not be tolerated. Between 1696 and 1699, Newton was responsible for the prosecution of over 100 counterfeiters. Many of them were executed. They were hanged. And Newton attended the executions. He watched them die, and he felt what satisfaction, justice, or something darker. The thing is, counterfeiting was a crime of desperation. Most of the people Newton prosecuted weren't wealthy criminals. They weren't sophisticated operators. They were poor people trying to survive. They were people who were hungry, who were desperate, who saw counterfeiting as a way to make money when there were no other options available to them. And Newton, who had himself known poverty and desperation, who had himself been rejected and marginalized, showed them no mercy. He thought as he pursued them, they are breaking the law. They are criminals. They deserve punishment. They deserve to die. But somewhere inside him, there was another voice, a voice that remembered what it was like to be desperate, a voice that remembered what it was like to be on the outside, a voice that wanted to say, these are people, these are human beings, they are not so different from me. But he silenced that voice. He pushed it down. He focused instead on the law, on order, on control, on the exercise of power. This is when Newton changed. This is when the isolation and the fear and the need for control that had made him a genius began to transform him into something else, something harder, something colder, something that was losing touch with the humanity that had always been underneath his brilliance. He became increasingly isolated. Even as he held a position of power, he had few friends. He had no family to speak of. He had no intimate relationships. He lived alone. He worked constantly. He was consumed by his duties at the mint, by his position at the Royal Society, by his ongoing disputes with other scientists. He was also becoming increasingly paranoid. He believed that people were trying to steal his ideas. He believed that people were trying to undermine him. He believed that people were conspiring against him. Some of this was probably true. In the world of science and academia, there was genuine competition and conflict. But Newton's paranoia went beyond what was reasonable. He saw enemies everywhere. He saw threats where there were none. He felt during these years, everyone wants something from me. Everyone is trying to use me. Everyone is trying to take what I've built. I must protect myself. I must control everything. And so he did. He controlled his work. He controlled his reputation. He controlled his position. He controlled everyone around him. He became a tyrant in his own way. Not a violent tyrant, but a tyrant nonetheless. Someone who demanded absolute obedience. Someone who could not tolerate disagreement. Someone who used his authority to punish anyone who challenged him. His work at the mint, which should have been a way for him to serve the public good, became instead a way for him to exercise power. He became obsessed with catching counterfeiters, not because he believed deeply in justice, but because it gave him something to control. It gave him an enemy to fight. It gave him a way to use his intellect and his authority to destroy people. And as he did this, he lost something. He lost the wonder. He lost the curiosity. He lost the pure joy of discovery that had driven him when he was younger, when he was alone in his study during the plague years, working on calculus and gravity. He was driven by genuine curiosity about how the world worked. He wanted to understand. He wanted to know. He wanted to see into the mind of God. But now, as he pursued counterfeiters and fought with other scientists and consolidated his power, he was driven by something else. He was driven by fear, by the need to control, by the need to prove that he was superior, by the need to punish anyone who threatened him. He knew this somewhere, deep inside. He knew that he had changed. He knew that he was no longer the young man who had made those miraculous discoveries during the plague years. He was someone else now, someone harder, someone colder, someone who had let power corrupt him in subtle but profound ways. There's a story from this period that illustrates what had happened to him. A young mathematician named William Whiston was working at Cambridge. He was brilliant. He had ideas about mathematics and physics, and he made the mistake of disagreeing with Newton about something. He suggested an alternative interpretation of one of Newton's theories. Newton was furious. He didn't engage with Whiston's ideas. He didn't discuss them. He didn't try to understand them. Instead, he used his influence to have Whiston removed from his position at Cambridge. He destroyed Whiston's career because Whiston had the audacity to disagree with him. When he did this, Newton felt a rush of satisfaction. He felt powerful. He felt in control. But he also felt something else. He felt a deep, gnawing sense of regret, because he knew in that moment that he had become someone he didn't want to be. He had become someone who used power to silence dissent rather than to advance knowledge. He had become someone who was more concerned with his own authority than with truth. He thought in a quiet moment alone, "What have I become? I have discovered the laws of nature. I have understood the universe in ways that no one else has. And yet, I am using my power to destroy people. I am using my authority to silence voices. I am becoming a tyrant." But he couldn't stop. He didn't know how to stop. The isolation that had made him a genius had also made him incapable of genuine human connection. The fear that had driven him to excel had also made him paranoid and controlling. The need for control that had allowed him to focus on his work had also made him unable to tolerate any challenge to his authority. So he continued. He continued to pursue counterfeiters. He continued to fight with other scientists. He continued to consolidate his power. And with each passing year, he moved further and further away from the young man who had made those miraculous discoveries. He moved further away from the person who had been driven by pure curiosity and wonder. He became something else, someone else, and he knew it, and he couldn't do anything about it. By the time Isaac Newton reached his 60s, he was a legend. He was Sir Isaac Newton, now knighted by the king. He was the president of the Royal Society. He was the master of the Royal Mint. He was the greatest scientist in the world. His name was known throughout Europe. His theories were taught in universities. His Principia was considered the foundation of modern science. He had achieved everything that a scholar could possibly achieve. He had reached the pinnacle of success, and he was profoundly, deeply alone. He had never married. He had no children. He had no close friends. He had no one to share his life with. The people around him were colleagues, or subordinates, or rivals. They were not friends. They were not companions. They were not people he could truly talk to, truly connect with. He had spent his entire life building walls around himself, and now those walls were so high and so thick that no one could reach him. He lived in a house in London, and later in a house in Kensington. He lived with his niece, Catherine Barton, who took care of him. But even with her, he maintained distance. He was polite. He was dutiful, but he was not warm. He was not open. He was not capable of the kind of genuine intimacy that comes from truly letting someone know you. His work at the Mint had ended. He had retired from that position, and now he had time. Time to think. Time to reflect. Time to work on his science again if he wanted to. But he didn't want to. Not really. The fire that had driven him when he was younger had burned out. The curiosity that had consumed him during the plague years had faded. He was going through the motions of being Isaac Newton, but the man inside was tired. He spent his later years working on alchemy. This might seem strange to us now. We think of alchemy as superstition, as the desperate attempt of medieval minds to turn lead into gold. But for Newton, alchemy was something different. It was a continuation of his search for understanding. It was an attempt to understand the hidden forces that governed matter itself. It was, in some ways, a return to the wonder and curiosity that had driven him as a young man. He filled thousands of pages with alchemical notes. He conducted experiments. He tried to understand the nature of matter at its most fundamental level. He was searching for something. Not gold exactly, but understanding, connection, meaning. He was searching for the same thing he'd always been searching for, but now he was searching in a different place. He also spent time on biblical interpretation. He studied the Bible intensely. He tried to decode its mysteries. He believed that the Bible contained hidden knowledge, that if you looked carefully enough, if you understood the numerology and the symbolism, you could find profound truths about God and the universe. He spent years on this work, years of his life devoted to trying to unlock secrets that in the end remained locked. He felt during these years, I have understood so much. I have seen so deeply into the nature of reality. And yet, there is still so much I don't understand. There are still mysteries. There are still secrets. And I am running out of time. The irony is profound. Newton had spent his life solving mysteries. He had figured out gravity. He had understood light. He had invented calculus. He had created a mathematical description of the universe that was so elegant and so powerful that it would dominate science for the next 300 years. And yet in his later years, he was confronted with mysteries that he couldn't solve, problems that his methods couldn't address, questions that his brilliant mind couldn't answer. He never solved the problem of action at a distance. How could gravity act across empty space? How could the Earth pull on the moon when there was nothing between them? He had described how gravity worked mathematically, but he had never explained why it worked. What was the mechanism? What was the force? What was the nature of this mysterious attraction that held the universe together? He also never fully understood light. He had done brilliant work on optics. He had separated white light into its component colors. He had described how light behaved, but he didn't understand what light actually was. Was it a particle Was it a wave? How could it be both? These questions haunted him. He had glimpsed the mysteries of light, but he had never fully grasped them. And there was something else that troubled him, something that he had never been able to reconcile. His science described a universe that was purely mechanical, a universe that operated according to mathematical laws, a universe that had no room for God, no room for purpose, no room for meaning. And yet Newton believed deeply in God. He believed that the universe was God's creation. He believed that understanding the laws of nature was a way of understanding God's mind. But how could both be true? How could the universe be both purely mechanical and also the expression of God's will? How could there be both determinism and free will? How could there be both law and purpose? These were the questions that haunted him in his later years. These were the mysteries that his brilliant mind could not solve. He thought in the quiet of his study, I have built a great edifice of knowledge, but there are cracks in the foundation. There are questions I cannot answer. There are mysteries I cannot solve. And I am running out of time to find the answers. By his 70s, Newton was in decline. His health was failing. He was still mentally sharp, but his body was wearing out. He was still working, still thinking, still trying to understand. But he was also beginning to accept that there were some things he would never know. Some mysteries that would remain mysteries. Some questions that would never be answered. He reflected on his life. On the boy who had been rejected and abandoned. On the young man who had made miraculous discoveries during the plague years. On the genius who had changed human understanding of the universe. On the powerful man who had used his authority to punish and control. On the old man who was now alone with his thoughts and his regrets. He knew, I have lived an extraordinary life. I have accomplished things that few people ever accomplish. I have understood things that few people ever understand. And yet, I have also lost things. I have lost the capacity for genuine human connection. I have lost the wonder and joy that drove me when I was young. I have lost my humanity in the pursuit of understanding. It was a bitter knowledge, a painful knowledge, but it was also in some way a liberating knowledge. Because in accepting what he had lost, he was also accepting what he was. He was accepting that he was not a god. He was not all-knowing. He was not all-powerful. He was a human being, a brilliant human being, yes, but also a flawed one, a lonely one, a man who had paid a price for his genius. In 1727, Isaac Newton died. He was 84 years old. He died in his sleep peacefully in his house in Kensington. He left behind an enormous legacy. His Principia was still the foundation of physics. His work on calculus was still revolutionizing mathematics. His discoveries about light were still shaping optics. His influence on science and philosophy was immense and would continue to grow. But he also left behind unfinished work, mysteries unsolved, questions unanswered. The alchemical notes that he had filled with such care and such hope remained largely incomprehensible. The biblical interpretations that he had spent so much time on were largely forgotten. The deeper questions about the nature of reality that had haunted him remained unanswered. He left behind, too, a cautionary tale, a story about what happens when genius is combined with isolation. What happens when a brilliant mind is shaped by rejection and abandonment? What happens when someone uses their intellect to build walls instead of bridges? What happens when power corrupts even in subtle ways? What happens when someone sacrifices their humanity in the pursuit of understanding? He felt in those final years a strange peace. He knew, I have done what I was meant to do. I have understood what I was meant to understand. I have lived the life that I was meant to live. And now I can rest. I can let go. I can accept that I am not perfect, that I am not all-knowing, that I am simply a man who tried his best to understand the universe. And that is enough. So here we are at the end of Newton's story, and I want you to think about what we've just heard. We've followed a boy from his birth, unwanted, abandoned, rejected. We've watched him transform that pain into purpose. We've seen him discover things that change the world, and we've watched him lose something precious in the process. We've watched him become powerful, and in becoming powerful, lose touch with the very humanity that made his discoveries possible. What does this teach us? I think it teaches us something we need to hear, especially when we're lying in bed, thinking about our own struggles. Newton's story isn't really about apples or gravity or calculus. It's about what happens when we're hurt, when we're rejected, when we feel like we don't belong. It's about how we can transform that pain into something meaningful. But it's also about the cost of that transformation, the price we pay for isolation, the danger of letting our wounds harden us into something we don't want to be. Newton was a genius, but he was also a cautionary tale. He shows us that brilliance without connection is hollow, that achievement without compassion is empty, that understanding the universe means nothing if we lose understanding of ourselves and of others. As you're lying there, as your eyes are getting heavier, as you're drifting towards sleep, I want you to hold on to something. Hold on to the idea that your struggles are not wasted. They are part of your story, just like Newton's struggles were part of his. But also hold on to the idea that you don't have to become hard. You don't have to lose your humanity in pursuit of your dreams. You can be brilliant and kind. You can be ambitious and connected. You can achieve great things without sacrificing the people you love or the person you are. Newton couldn't do that. But you can. You have that choice. And that's a gift he never had. For now, though, just rest. You've heard his story. You've walked with him through his loneliness and his genius and his regrets. You've learned what you needed to learn. So close your eyes. Let your mind settle. Let sleep come to you gently. You're doing the best you can, and that's enough. Sleep well